It was supposed to be an ordinary day in a quiet cafe. Barron Trump sat alone, enjoying a moment of peace, when a complete stranger suddenly targeted him. The man's voice grew louder, his words harsher, cutting through the calm atmosphere like a knife. The entire cafe froze. People whispered in disbelief, their eyes shifting between Barron and the man who wouldn't back down. Would Barron retaliate? Would someone step in to stop the chaos? Or would this turn into something far worse? What Barron did next left everyone speechless, and it changed how they saw him forever. If you're intrigued, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. The cafe was a cozy retreat, nestled on a quiet street corner, with the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the air. The rich aroma of espresso mingled with the subtle sweetness of pastries, fresh out of the oven, creating a warmth that drew people in from the chilly morning outside. The soft hum of conversation filled the room, punctuated by the occasional clink of ceramic mugs being set back onto saucers. A barista worked behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine and the rhythmic tapping of coffee grounds adding to the symphony of sounds. Sunlight poured through large windows, casting a golden glow over the rustic wooden tables and the mismatched chairs that gave the cafe its charm. People sat in small groups, leaning in over their cups, sharing quiet laughter and stories. A young couple held hands by the window, while an older gentleman flipped through the pages of a worn-out novel, pausing occasionally to sip his cappuccino. A few others worked diligently on laptops, their faces illuminated by the soft blue light of their screens. And there, in the corner, sat Barron Trump. His presence was understated, yet it caught the attention of a few curious glances. He seemed focused, sipping from his cup, as he occasionally glanced out the window, lost in thought. Despite his family name, there was nothing flashy about him. Just a calm, composed young man enjoying a moment of solitude. The scene was peaceful, serene even, until the heavy creak of the door broke the rhythm of the cafe. A man walked in, his movements brisk and his energy loud, immediately shifting the atmosphere. Barron Trump sat at a small table near the back of the cafe, a quiet spot tucked away from the center of attention. In front of him, a steaming cup of black coffee rested on the table, the faint curl of steam rising into the air. His hands, large yet gentle, held a worn paperback book, its corners slightly frayed. It was clear he wasn't reading it for show. It was the kind of book someone dives into when they enjoy being lost in a story. Every so often, he'd take a slow sip from his cup, glancing out the window as if lost in thought. The faint hum of the cafe surrounded him, but he seemed completely at ease in his own company. There was no entourage, no flashy display of wealth, just Barron, blending into the space like any other young man finding a quiet moment to himself. Despite his famous last name, there was nothing ostentatious about him. He didn't demand attention or act entitled. In fact, most people wouldn't have noticed who he was unless they took a closer look. There was something grounded about him. Perhaps it was his calm demeanor or the way he treated his surroundings with respect. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he turned a page, a rare moment of unguarded ease. But the peaceful rhythm of the cafe was about to change. The soft chime of the cafe doorbell rang out, louder than usual, as it swung open with force. A gust of cold air followed, and with it, a man entered. His heavy footsteps thudded against the floor, disrupting the calm with an almost jarring energy. He walked with a sense of urgency, his presence immediately commanding attention. Conversations grew quieter, and a subtle tension seemed to ripple through the room, like an invisible weight settling over the cafe. Barron didn't look up right away, but it was impossible not to notice the shift. The peaceful hum of the cafe was no longer the same. It felt sharper, heavier, like the calm before a storm. The door slammed shut behind the man, louder than it should have been, causing heads to turn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a wrinkled blazer over a shirt that looked like it had seen better days. His face was flushed, as though he had just hurried there or was already irritated before he arrived. His footsteps were heavy, purposeful, each one echoing in the previously quiet cafe. Without waiting his turn, he strode straight to the counter, cutting in front of an older woman who had been patiently waiting to order. "Yeah, I'll take a black coffee," he barked, ignoring the startled look from the barista. "And make it quick, all right? I don't have all day." The woman he had cut in front of opened her mouth to protest, but the man shot her a quick, dismissive glance. She quietly stepped back, visibly uncomfortable. The barista, a young man who looked like he had just started his shift, nodded nervously and hurried to prepare the order. The cafe's warm, welcoming atmosphere felt like it had been pierced by a sharp needle. Conversations had dropped to hushed whispers, and the usual clinks of mugs and plates seemed muffled. The man's energy was disruptive, his presence unavoidable. As he stood at the counter, tapping his fingers impatiently, his eyes scanned the room. They landed on Barron. At first, it was a casual glance, but then his gaze lingered. Something about Barron's calm presence seemed to irritate him, as though he had decided, in that moment, that Barron didn't belong there. The man grabbed his coffee and turned toward Barron's table, walking over with slow, deliberate steps. The air seemed to grow heavier with each one. "You've got to be kidding me," the man muttered under his breath, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Sitting there like you own the place. What? Think you're better than everyone else?" Barron looked up from his book, his expression calm and composed. He didn't say anything, but the way he met the man's gaze was enough to draw the attention of everyone in the cafe. The man leaned slightly closer, pointing a finger at Barron. "What are you, some kind of spoiled rich kid? Huh? You think the rules don't apply to you?" The cafe was now completely silent, all eyes on the unfolding scene. A couple near the window whispered nervously, and the barista froze mid-step, holding a tray of cups. Barron slowly closed his book, placing it carefully on the table. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he refused to be rattled by the man's aggression. He looked up at the stranger with an expression that was hard to read, calm, but also unflinchingly direct. The man's voice grew louder, feeding off the tension. "Typical. No response, huh? Probably used to everyone kissing up to you." "Well, not me. I'm not impressed." The hostility in the air was almost tangible now, the stranger's words slicing through the heavy silence. Every pair of eyes in the cafe was locked on Barron, waiting to see how he would respond. The stranger's voice grew louder, his words cutting through the tense silence like a blade. He stood towering over Barron, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his grip, as his anger seemed to boil over. "Look at you, sitting there all smug, like you're better than everyone else. Let me guess. Daddy's money got you this cozy little seat, huh?" he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you even know what it's like to work for something? To struggle for a single thing in your life?" The cafe seemed frozen in time. Conversations had stopped completely, and the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. A young woman sitting a few tables away clutched her coffee cup tightly, her eyes darting nervously between Barron and the stranger. An older man at the counter shook his head in quiet disapproval, but stayed silent, his hands resting on his newspaper. Even the barista stood still, his tray of cups forgotten in his hands, too stunned to move. Barron, however, remained calm. He didn't flinch or shrink under the weight of the man's tirade. Instead, he sat with an unshakable composure, his posture relaxed but alert. He looked up at the stranger, his expression steady, as if silently inviting him to vent every ounce of frustration he carried. But the man wasn't done. "People like you don't even live in the real world," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "You sit in your fancy houses, sipping on overpriced coffee, while the rest of us are out here breaking our backs just to get by. You don't know anything about hard work or sacrifice. You just waltz into places like this, acting like you own them." The stranger's face was now red with anger, and his hand gestured wildly as he spoke. "And look at you, not even saying anything. What? Too good to talk to someone like me? Afraid to get your hands dirty?" A few people in the cafe exchanged uneasy glances. Some seemed to silently urge someone, anyone, to step in, while others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid to get involved. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Barron remained unshaken. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze never leaving the man. His silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. It was a calm that carried a weight of its own, making the stranger's outburst seem even more chaotic in contrast. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me?" the man spat, his voice now echoing in the small cafe. "That's the problem with your kind. You think you're untouchable. But let me tell you something. You're not. Not here. Not now." The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Barron's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the stranger's growing rage, a quiet strength that seemed to shift the energy in the room. Barron sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the man's furious expression. For a moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to respond at all. The cafe held its breath, every pair of eyes fixed on him. People were wondering, would he retaliate? Would he lose his cool? But Barron didn't move immediately. Instead, he placed both hands flat on the table, almost as if grounding himself. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his expression calm but thoughtful. It wasn't fear or hesitation that kept him quiet. It was something deeper, something intentional. He glanced down at his coffee cup for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping its edge. Then, finally, he looked back up at the man, his voice steady and composed. "You're right," he said quietly, his tone measured but firm. "I don't know what you're going through, and I don't know what brought you to this moment, where you felt the need to take it out on me." The man blinked, momentarily caught off guard. His mouth opened as if to interrupt, but Barron's voice, though calm, carried an unexpected authority that silenced him. "But," Barron continued, leaning forward slightly, "what I do know is that none of us are perfect. We all have struggles. Some of them are just easier to see than others." The man's anger faltered, his posture stiffening. Around the cafe, people exchanged surprised glances, their expressions shifting from discomfort to quiet admiration. Barron's words weren't defensive or confrontational. They were something entirely unexpected. "I don't know what's going on in your life," Barron said, his voice softening just enough to draw everyone in closer. "But if yelling at me helps you feel better, then I'll take it. If this moment makes your day just a little easier, I'll let you have it." The man's hand, which had been gesturing wildly moments before, now dropped to his side. His face twitched. Anger still lingered in his eyes, but something else was there now. Confusion. Reflection. Barron reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp bill. "Let me buy you another coffee," he said, holding it out to the man. "On me." The cafe went dead silent. Even the barista froze, his hand hovering over the espresso machine. Everyone's eyes darted between Barron and the man, disbelief etched on their faces. The man stared at the bill, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse, but then his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, and the fire in his eyes began to fade. "I don't need your money," he muttered, his voice quieter now, almost embarrassed. "It's not about the money," Barron replied, his tone unwavering. "It's about starting over. This doesn't have to be how your day ends." The stranger stood there, motionless, as if Barron's words had struck a nerve he wasn't ready to face. The café, still silent, began to shift. People who had been too afraid to intervene now watched with awe. A few even smiled, their tension melting into admiration. Slowly, the man reached out and took the bill, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't say, "Thank you." He couldn't. Instead, he nodded stiffly and turned away, walking toward the counter with less of the swagger he'd entered with. As the door closed behind him a few moments later, a soft murmur spread through the café. Someone clapped quietly, and a few others followed, their applause gentle but filled with respect. Barron picked up his book again, opening it as if nothing had happened. The tension in the café dissolved, replaced by a newfound warmth. It was clear to everyone in the room. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. The man stood there, clutching the bill in his hand, his gaze fixed on it as if it held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and his shoulders, which had been stiff with anger, now sagged slightly under the weight of something far more profound. He glanced back at Barron, his expression no longer fiery or accusatory. Instead, his face showed a mix of emotions: confusion, shame, and perhaps even regret. For the first time, he seemed to truly see Barron, not as a name or a stereotype, but as a person. "The man began, his voice rough and hesitant. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know what to say." Barron looked up from his book, offering a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to say anything," he replied gently. "We all have our moments. What matters is what we do next." The man nodded slowly, his eyes darting around the room as if realizing, for the first time, that he had an audience. The quiet judgment that had greeted his outburst was now replaced with something else, a collective sense of quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low but sincere. He wasn't just speaking to Barron. He was speaking to everyone in the café. "I let my frustration get the better of me. That wasn't fair to you, or anyone here." A ripple of soft murmurs passed through the room. A few patrons nodded approvingly, their earlier discomfort replaced with respect for the man's unexpected humility. Barron nodded back, his expression still calm and kind. "Apology accepted," he said simply. For a moment, the man lingered, as if wanting to say more, but unsure how. Then, with a final nod, he turned and walked toward the door. His steps were slower now, his posture less rigid, as though he had shed a weight he didn't realize he was carrying. As the door closed behind him, the café seemed to exhale all at once. The tension that had gripped the room dissolved completely, replaced by a warm, collective sense of admiration for what they had just witnessed. A young woman seated nearby leaned toward her friend, whispering, "Did you see that? That was incredible." An older man at the counter chuckled softly. "That kid's got more composure than most grown men I've ever met," he said, shaking his head in admiration. The barista, who had been frozen in place earlier, finally set down his tray and spoke up. "I've worked here for years," he said to no one in particular, "and I've never seen anything like that. He just handled it." The cafe seemed lighter now, as if Barron's calm demeanor and unexpected kindness had shifted the very energy of the space. People smiled at one another, some even exchanging quiet words about how remarkable the moment had been. Barron, meanwhile, returned to his book, his expression peaceful. He seemed unaffected by the attention, as if this kind of grace came naturally to him. As patrons left the cafe, many walked away with a newfound sense of inspiration. They had come in for coffee and conversation, but left with something far more meaningful, a reminder of the power of calm, kindness, and understanding, even in the face of hostility. Outside, the man who had stormed in earlier paused on the sidewalk. He looked back at the cafe through the glass, watching Barron for a moment. His expression was softer now, thoughtful, as if replaying the encounter in his mind. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and walked away, his steps quieter than before. Inside the cafe, life went on. But for everyone who had been there that day, it wasn't just another morning. It was a moment they would remember. The key takeaway from this powerful encounter is simple but profound. Composure, kindness, and grace can diffuse even the most hostile situations. Barron's ability to remain calm and respond with understanding rather than anger didn't just change the course of the moment. It changed the people in the room. His actions reflected a level of maturity and inner strength that transcends both age and privilege. In that moment, Barron reminded everyone watching that it's not about who you are or what name you carry. It's about how you choose to respond when faced with adversity. And maybe that's the real lesson here. When we're confronted with anger or misunderstanding, we always have a choice. Will we let hostility define us, or will we rise above it with kindness? The next time you face a moment of conflict, ask yourself, will my reaction make things better or worse? Because, as Barron showed us, sometimes the strongest response is the calmest one.